All right, let's dive into week 2. So we're doing Four Noble Truths, Eightfold Path, and Precepts. That is a lot of ground to cover. Clearly, we're not going all the way to the bottom of these things. So again, I mentioned last week, my hope for this is that you heard the words and you can at least know what things are centralized in this tradition and what things to at least be aware of that you're going to run into over and over again. And then you can do your own study, or as your life unfolds. It's all unraveling at this point. Yeah, as your life unfolds and your practice unfolds, these things will come back to you. The sort of image that sometimes we use for this sort of practice is it's a spiral, right? So you encounter something and you practice with it, and then at some point you encounter it again, and you're in a different place in your practice, and it means there's something else, there's another layer, and then you go around again, and then there's another layer, right? So these are things we come back to over and over in our practice, and it's why I had every confidence that beginners could come to these discussions, and people who've been practicing for 30 years could come to these discussions, and there would be some aha moment, right? Because these things are not two-dimensional. So Four Noble Truths. I think we can say that these things are the bedrock of all of the Buddhist teaching and practice. You cannot probably encounter a Buddhist sect or school or practitioner who is not aware of and practicing with the Four Noble Truths. So this is one of the things that Shakyamuni woke up to under the Bodhi tree. Last time we talked a little bit about Shakyamuni's life and his awakening. Four Noble Truths is one of the things he woke up to under the Bodhi tree because, of course, he sat down there resolving not to get up until he understood the nature of suffering. And this is what the Four Noble Truths are all about. So these things describe his understanding of where suffering comes from, and on that basis, good news is there's something we can do about that. So suffering is not something which is visited upon us from outside, from a deity, from a wrathful universe, right? We have some control over suffering. So when he understood the nature of that, aha, there was something we could do about it. So this first noble truth, life is characterized by suffering, sometimes unease, sometimes dissatisfaction. So we encounter a word like suffering and we think, oh, this is big catastrophic suffering. This is a tree falls on my house. This is my partner gets sick and dies. This is I lose my job. We think suffering, right? So it's useful to know this sometimes gets translated simply as dissatisfaction, dis-ease, unease. There's something niggling that says things are not okay. And that could be something as simple as, I want more chocolate cake. That doesn't have to be catastrophic suffering. So what we're talking about here often, birth, aging, illness, death. Those are sort of the four, things that we think about when we think about suffering, physical pain. Another way to think about this is, we want things we don't have. We have things we don't want. We're worried that even the good things in our lives will disappear. So even we think we're going along pretty well, this first noble truth is always in play. So when you talk to your friends and family and they say, oh, you do this Buddhist thing, what's that about? And you go, well, Buddha said life is characterized by suffering. And they go, well, what a pessimistic religion. I'm okay. I don't have suffering. What are you talking about? I'm happy, I'm fine. Well, we have to understand that suffering can even be, I have wonderful things and I'm afraid they're going to disappear. I'm in a wonderful relationship and I'm afraid my partner's going to leave me, right? There's always this little thing that says basing my life on these things is not balanced. It's not forever. So we can see based on the first noble truth where the second noble truth comes from. Suffering is caused by desire, attachment, craving, clinging. The other side of craving, by the way, is aversion. So desire does not only mean I want things I don't have, it also means there's things in my life that I don't want. Craving and aversion are the same energy. It's just the opposite, just backwards, right? So we're constantly wanting things to be different. So when I'm talking with people about suffering, one of the ways I characterize that with people is we always want things to be other than they are. There's probably not a moment in life where we don't want something to be other than it is. So clinging, craving, aversion, grasping, greed, all of that is about this thing. I think in your handout I've given you the Sanskrit for this, right? Did I give you tanha and dukkha and all that? Yeah. So you can look up those Sanskrit words if you really want to sort of dig into that, right? So dukkha, sometimes people will use dukkha instead of suffering, so it's good to know what that word means. Tanha is the connotation of this thing is like a thirsting desire. And that's a little bit different than I want the latest, fashion at the mall. There's this thirsting desire that just says, I must have whatever this thing is, right?
Etymology is stuck.
Stuck. Yep, you're stuck. So, useful to know those things, right? Okay. Good news is, for a third noble truth, we can break out of that desire. There is something we can do about it. It is possible to liberate ourselves from suffering. Again, this is not something which is visited upon us from an outside source that we don't have any control over, that we can't do anything about. It is possible to liberate ourselves from suffering. It is possible to see, in this practice, how our suffering arises, where that comes from, how we create it, how we perpetuate it for ourselves. We would think suffering, I want to get rid of my suffering. Well, there are ways we cling to our suffering even. It makes us into somebody, right? How do we perpetuate our suffering for ourselves and for others? And how do we stop doing that? So, life is characterized by suffering, but there's something we can do to change our relationship to suffering. And here's where we start to see things like, oh, pain and suffering are not the same thing. And peace is not the absence of suffering, right? If life is characterized by desire, if life is characterized by suffering, the logical extension of that is if suffering and, if you have to get rid of all your suffering in order to have peace, then you cannot live peacefully, and Buddha never said that. So, our suffering stops being about creating self. It stops being self-centered. It stops being a way to create our identity, which is a lot of what our suffering is about, a lot of what we're doing with our suffering. We can actually look at the way our suffering arises and use that as a dharma gate. We can use those karmic circumstances as a dharma gate to cultivate compassion for ourselves and for other beings, right? It takes wisdom to see what's going on, and then the sort of close partner of that is compassion arises for ourselves and for other beings. Fourth noble truth is that the Eightfold Path is the way that we do that practice. If we engage in the Eightfold Path, that is a means to well-being, to liberating ourselves and other beings from suffering, right? So, this is a wonderful reminder for us that Buddhism is a practice. It is not simply a philosophy that we read about in a book, that we leave on the nightstand. It's not something we simply debate in a chat room online, right? Yes, there is such a thing as Buddhist philosophy, but for us, really, it's important that we understand and remember Buddhism is a practice. It's not something abstract. It's not a set of mental gymnastics. It's not about how many sutras can we memorize and how many Dogen quotes can we parrot. It's about what are we doing with this body and mind. And that's where the Eightfold Path comes in. So there's something we actually have to do, and we have to do it for ourselves. There is no outside being, outside force that's going to do it for us. Our teachers aren't going to do it for us, and we know here at Sanshin, reliance is a big piece of our practice vision. There's something we have to do with our own bodies and minds, and it has to be us. Okay. We're going to talk about the Eightfold Path. Any brief questions about Four Noble Truths? And we will have time at the end, of course, to ask and discuss. Any immediate burning questions? Okay. So, Eightfold Path. So these 8 elements of the Eightfold Path fall into 3 categories: prajna, shila, samadhi. So prajna, wisdom, right? Which includes right view, right intention. Shila is the morality, ethics, precept piece, right? So right speech, right action, right livelihood, which is really about what are we doing with this body. Samadhi is concentration. So that's right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. So you will notice that the Eightfold Path uses this word right in front of each of these elements. This is not right as opposed to wrong. This is not you do this way, it's right, you do anything else, it's wrong, and you're condemned to suffer in one of the many, many, many layers of hell realms forever and ever, right? Not that kind of right. This is in the sense of being in alignment with the way the universe actually works. Are we creating dissonance? Are we creating suffering? Are we working against ourselves and other beings, right? That's how we can view that sort of right. If we're doing things under this right, we're not creating additional karma and suffering and disturbance for ourselves and others. In early Buddhism, it might be we're not setting up the conditions where we're going to be reborn in this world to keep on, reborn in samsara to keep on suffering, right? Okay, so these three groups and these 8 elements, I think, help us to create a balanced life, a sustainable kind of balanced life. Trying to work on any one of these without working on the other ones doesn't work so well. That's not to say we can't decide, for the next month in my practice, I'm really going to focus on, right speech. We can do that. But to isolate 1 or 2, or even a group of those, one of the categories and say, the rest of them don't matter, doesn't work very well, for the same reasons that we have 16 precepts and we need to do 16 and not 1 or 2, right? These things are really, really interconnected. If you're doing, mindfulness, for instance, without zazen, without precepts, it's frustrating, it's not sustainable, it won't last, you won't feel like you have a balance, right? So on the back of your handout, you will notice there is a Dharma wheel. I've given you the picture of the Dharma wheel with the Eightfold Path. I'm sorry, that's a little bit grainy. Clearly, I grabbed it and stuck it on the page for you. What's important about this is this thing is a wheel, it's not a line. So the wheel spins both directions. Sometimes we hear about this image, right, in Buddhism of the Dharma wheel, turning the Dharma wheel. Turning the Dharma wheel can mean teaching, but it can also just mean practicing, right? So the activity of practice, this wheel is going forth and back. And in this diagram, you can see they're also kind of linked across the wheel. Now, I'm not saying that, right effort is directly linked to, right awareness, and that's the only link. Don't take that literally. But the point of this thing is these things arise together for us. It's not that we work on one and then we work on the next and then we work on the next and then we pass that test and we go on to, right? These things are arising, functioning, moving together all the time. So this thing is a wheel. It's not a set of steps. It's not a linear path. Okay? So, briefly looking at each of these, and again, it will be brief, given the time we have. Right view. Right view is really about seeing and understanding these 4 noble truths. It's about really seeing and understanding that this Eightfold Path is a better means to a wholesome life than getting caught up in our karma and our delusion and clinging and grasping. And right, we can see very clearly that this is a wholesome way to go. This is a wholesome path. So it might sound like this is an intellectual exercise. It is not. Right view sounds like, oh, that's my thinking, that's my intellect. It's not. The way we get to grips with this thing is to get on the cushion. Like we just did for half an hour, right? Settling down in zazen, seeing through the fabrications, the cravings, the grasping, getting that even though we're all baby bodhisattvas on this path, right? No matter how long we've been practicing, we're going to continue to fall off the path. We'll talk about vow and repentance at some point, right? We're going to have an aspiration to walk this Eightfold Path. We're going to fall off, and nonetheless, this is a good thing. To aspire to live in Buddha's way is a healthy, wholesome thing. Not just because we're sort of taking that because somebody says so, but we actually clearly see this is the way we need to be working. So it's not about accepting dogma. It's not about doing or believing, what a teacher says or even what the Buddha says, right? It's about cultivating our own experiences of clarity. How do we get to clarity? How do we get to wisdom? This is what keeps aspiration strong so we don't give up, right? We see a little bit. We understand something. It's like, oh, yeah. There's a reason to keep going with this, right? Okay, right intention, sometimes translated right thought, right resolve, right aspiration, right? So the main idea is thought leads to speech and action. So it's important to pay attention to thought and cultivate wholesome thought, because if we don't, or even if we do, the next thing we're going to do is say something, and the next thing we're going to do is take some action with this body. So if thoughts go off the rails, the rest of that sequence goes off the rails. So it's really important to pay attention to intention, thought, resolve, right? It's easy to just sort of let habituated thinking rise up and drag us around. Maybe we don't notice we're in the grips of habituated thinking. We just sort of react to things without any real intention. This is why intention is important. I intend to live like a bodhisattva. I intend to not get hijacked by my stuff. I'm still going to get hijacked by my stuff because I'm in this karmic form, but my intention is not to just ride that train out of town. My intention is to go, oh, wait a minute. Is this really the wholesome thing to do, say, think, right? So if we don't do that, then we deal with the consequences. We deal with the suffering to ourselves or to other beings, right? So intention is important. So the good news, again, is that we have a choice. We don't need to just mindlessly react to our stuff or to circumstances without setting any particular intention. We don't have to feel blindsided by the resulting suffering or conflict, or we don't need to feel powerless to escape from something. We can set some intention. So in Zazen, we can begin to notice that habituated thinking. Usually, we're not paying much attention to what's arising, right? We're simply in the world responding to things moment by moment by moment. We just sort of take our thoughts to be a complete, accurate representation of the way the world actually is. Well, then we can start to see, oh, wait a minute. What I thought was true isn't necessarily the whole story. It might not be that my thinking is wrong, it just might be incomplete, right? So we really can start to see, oh, my thinking is my story, right? It's not necessarily an accurate map of the world. We get to stop and realize my thoughts are my creations, or as Uchiyama Roshi says, fabrication. It's all fabrication. So, not the whole story. Okay, that's right intention. Right speech, really a critical part of our practice. Oh my goodness. There's almost no place we don't have an opportunity to deal with right speech. It's really connected to everything else we do. This is not just about saying nice things to each other or not saying uncomfortable things to each other. Right speech is really complicated because we'd like to think, oh, it's just nicey nice, and that's not what's going on. Sometimes we need to have a hard conversation, and that can be right speech. So, right speech is about refraining from the four evils, right? Lying, idle or frivolous speech, harsh or abusive speech, and divisive speech, which is like backbiting and malicious gossip and things that are designed to drive a wedge between people, right? So again, lying, idle or frivolous speech, harsh or abusive speech, or divisive speech. Backbiting, gossip, that sort of thing. These are the four evils, right? Now, if you've been around Sanshin at all, you've heard me talk about this more than once. If you look at my 108 Gates talk series, we come back to right speech quite a bit, and those four evils. So again, unwholesome thought leads to unwholesome speech, leads to unwholesome action. So in order to really watch right speech, we have to start by watching right thinking, right thought. So conflict can escalate very quickly, as we know, from I have an unwholesome thought to I say something unkind or inappropriate or something, and the next thing we know there's physical violence, and the next thing we know there's physical violence amongst more than one human being, and we just watch this thing, right, escalate and go off the rails. So maybe I tell a lie, maybe it's not even a big lie, and then I have to tell more lies to cover up the first one, right? I have to do things to manage that situation, and it just grows like Topsy and gets out of control. So the whole thing starts to spiral, right? Suffering, leads to more creation of karma for ourselves and for other beings. And we know, I don't need to provide you any examples of those things, right? We see that happen all the time. So that's right speech. Right action. Right action arises from this right view, right intention. Again, thought, speech, action. In order to carry out right action, we need to see reality as it actually is, sometimes called awakening, sometimes called enlightenment, although that's not a great word, right? We need to have wisdom to really see how reality works. So we understand suffering, we understand interdependence, we understand the true nature of self, how these things are all related. When we really understand how all of that works, then right action arises naturally, right? There's nothing we have to learn, there's no decision we have to make. As bodhisattvas, we move through the world taking right action because we see how to be in alignment with the Dharma, right? With the reality of how this universe is working. So when that's what's going on, we're not living in our own idea of the world, or as Toto-san was talking about on Sunday, right? The difference between living by vow and living by karma, right? If we live by vow, we're being pulled by our aspiration as bodhisattvas. If we're living by karma, we're being driven by greed, anger, and ignorance. And then the action that results from that is as skillful or not as those things are. So it's important that we really get that. So we're not living in a fantasy. We're not living in our world of fabrications and then responding to fabrications as opposed to responding to reality, how things are actually working. So if we don't see the reality of the world, we don't know what to do, right? We don't know how to act. We're clouded by our stuff. We've probably all had some experience of that where we take some action based on what we understand at the time, and later on we get some new piece of information and we go, oh, had I known that, had I seen that that was what was really going on, I would have done something else, right? I would have been more effective. So we do things based on our delusion. Sometimes we do things based on how we wish things were. Anyone ever done that? I don't want to look at this thing because that's not comfortable, that's not what I want, so I'm going to act based on what I wish was happening. And if we were outside looking at ourselves, we would go, what are we doing? Or we've seen other people do that, right? What are you doing? It's called denial, right? We don't want to operate from a place of denial. So we need to make an effort to sit, to see through delusion, to become very, very familiar with our own selves, with our own functioning, how our minds work, how we're creating self, how we're creating fabrication on what we think, how we think the world is. We need to sit to do that. So what we do matters. We might think we're little individual people in a little world doing our little things, you know, and that what we do doesn't matter. Well, there is nothing outside the Buddha way or outside this one unified reality. And if that's true, then what I do affects others, and what others do affects me, and there's no way around that, right? If non-separation is the way things are, there is no way that what we're doing isn't affecting somebody else, some other being, some unfolding karma somewhere, right? What a responsibility. So when we get to precepts and morality, I mean, we come back to that, right? It's like everything we do has an effect. So we don't get to slack off as bodhisattvas. Now, we shouldn't be paralyzed by that. It's possible to be paralyzed by that. Let's not, let's not do that. Okay, so consequences are bigger than ourselves. And you think about right action. Right livelihood. So there are 5 types of wrong livelihood for lay people in the early teachings. And I would say we're still working with these today. Those 5 wrong livelihoods: dealing in weapons, dealing in human beings, dealing in meat, intoxicants, or poison. Weapons, human beings, meat, intoxicants, and poison. Now, is that open to interpretation? You better believe it. Again, when we get to precepts, these are big, big conversations. So that's for lay people. For monks, there's also wrong livelihood. We're not supposed to tell fortunes. We're not supposed to interpret dreams. We're not supposed to cast spells and ask you for your money. Right? If you pay me a certain amount, I will cast a spell and everything will be okay for you. You can't ask me for that. I do read tarot from time to time, but only for me. So I won't do it for you and you can't pay me for it. Okay, so, they're just saying we need to live in the world of reality. Okay, so right livelihood, we understand work as a manifestation of Buddha nature, just like Zazen is a manifestation of Buddha nature. So when we go to work in the morning or at night, how is that different from doing Zazen? It might feel very, very different. We're not sitting quietly in a Zendo somewhere. So we might think, well, I go and do Zazen and then I go to work. I would challenge you and say, what's the difference between these things, right? It's all a manifestation of Buddha nature. There is no separation really between spiritual life, practice, and work. So how we carry our practice into the world, and also how we take that opportunity to investigate interconnectedness, to really appreciate, become aware of that, see how it functions, right, is a really interesting practice. So we frequently say here at Sanshin, we try to make the distinction and say people will think that when we have a work day, that's volunteer work. Work practice is not volunteer work. Work practice is practice. So it's not a case of I'm coming to the temple because I'm going to give something because I'm being magnanimous and it makes me feel good and then I'm going to go home and do something else. Or that a work day is somehow not a practice day. Work and practice are not separate, right? So, of course, right livelihood, not isolated from the rest of the Eightfold Path. We need right view, for instance, to discern what is or is not right livelihood. And I would say any activity, any practice activity in this Eightfold Path where we're dealing with human beings, we have to think about right livelihood, because it's not just the work we're doing in the office, it's what are we doing at home, what are we doing with our families, what are we doing in our neighborhoods, right? We can really extend this to say right action in a very particular way. Okay, So right livelihood, not separate from anything else. It's a chance to also practice right speech, to also practice right action, have right intention, right? It's a manifestation of something. And we spend a lot of time at work. So what a huge dharmic gate. Even if we don't have time to be sitting sesshin, we can bring our practice to work. Nobody has to know we're doing it. We don't have to get up on a box and try to convert people. I used to take when I worked for the government for 16 years, I took my practice to work. Not in an overt way, right? But it was there. Okay, right effort. Right effort is made up of something we sometimes call the 4 exertions or the 4 endeavors, depending on your translation. And these are very familiar. I'm sure you've heard them before, but this is where they kind of fit in, which is what makes this useful to me. So, keeping unwholesome states from arising, unwholesome states, abandoning unwholesome states that have already arisen, cultivating the arising of wholesome states, and perpetuating wholesome states that have arisen. So you see the pattern here, right? We want to keep the unwholesomeness from arising. If it does, we're going to let go of it. Instead, we're going to cultivate wholesomeness, and when that wholesomeness is here, we're going to try to keep it going, right? It's a simple pattern. 4 exertions or 4 endeavors. So unwholesomeness here refers to something that's caught up in the 3 poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance. So wholesomeness, greed, anger, and ignorance. 3 poisons, greed, anger, and ignorance. At some point, I'm sure we're going to look at the wheel of life, and then we'll see where they are right in the very hub of this thing, right? Not today, a future week. So greed, anger, and ignorance are the 3 poisons. This is the root of all of our delusion. And again, these things are interconnected. So if that's unwholesomeness, then wholesomeness, if we flip those around, wholesomeness is generosity, loving kindness, and wisdom. So we can say, we just flip it over and go, oh, we're headed away from this unwholesomeness and toward this wholesomeness. When we look at precepts, not here because we don't have time, but in the precepts retreat, we'll see there's a sort of prohibitory list, and then there's another list that says, here's what we do instead. We can always look at these things from both sides. So how do we do these 4 exertions? How do we keep unwholesomeness from arising? Well, we might be aware of what we could call temptation. Right? There's plenty of temptation. Let's avoid situations where we're likely to fall into bad habits or fall into mistakes or get pulled off track by, other people or whatever that might be for us. When we see those things starting, we can do something else. When we see unwholesomeness arising, let's be aware. And again, this is where being aware of how the suffering arises and how our thought patterns work and our habituated thinking is important. This is one reason sitting is important, right? We need to see this stuff starting to arise and choose to do something else, right intention. Yep. I'm being tempted by that chocolate cake and I'm trying to lose weight. Nope, choose the apple, And that's a simple example. There are lots of them. Okay, second one, abandoning unwholesome states that have arisen, right? So again, we need to see what's happening. We need to see where things are going, and we need to recognize the consequences, because it's pretty easy to go, it'll be okay. That outcome, that bad outcome, that'll never happen. Really? Has it happened every time to you before? Well, then it's probably going to happen again, right? Foolish. What is it that they say is doing the same thing and expecting a different result? Insanity. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Okay, so we can see what's happening. We can cultivate that opposite wholesome quality. If I'm feeling like stingy, miserly, and I see that's going on, somebody needs something from me, and I'm clinging to whatever that is, can I instead cultivate generosity? Can we do the opposite thing? So this is Zazen mind, right? Opening the hand, letting thoughts come and go, not getting stuck, right? Okay. So cultivating and perpetuating wholesome states, well, let's put ourselves in wholesome circumstances, which means containers where we can keep the precepts. It means surrounding ourselves with good friends. That can be Sangha, but that can be, grandma. That can be anybody who's a good influence, right? A wholesome influence on us. Let's do some healthy activity. Yes, that's Zazen. It might be walking. It might be art. It might be whatever feels wholesome, healthy. Let's do the wholesome thing as opposed to the thing that's going to keep us trapped in greed, anger, ignorance, delusion, suffering, clinging, right? So, right effort gives us the energy to practice. It's important that that energy is directed toward wholesomeness. And we do that with these elements of the Eightfold Path. So it's, again, not just one. We need the support of all of them. I'm artificially pulling them apart, but we can't actually do that. Otherwise, if we're not putting our energy into wholesomeness, we're putting it into perpetuating delusion and suffering. So this is one of the reasons, for instance, that morality is important. It's not just about we're going to get really, really focused. We're going to sit a lot of Zazen. We're going to get really, really focused. Well, we can get really, really focused on how am I going to be the world's best assassin. And that's not practice, right? Without the ethical piece, for instance, how do we use the energy, right? So right energy, we need to be focusing on something which is wholesome and helpful. Because again, we have to do our own practice. No one can do it for us. So we can have teachers, we can have Dharma friends, we can have Sangha. No one can do our practice for us. There's no liberation outside of our own activity. There's no practice without us doing practice. Practice isn't something sitting out here. Practice is what are we doing with this body and mind, right? So we rise and fall based on our own diligence. And again, non-reliance is one of the ways we talk about that here, right? We can only rely on our own bodhicitta. Right mindfulness. How are we doing? Okay. Right mindfulness. Well, there's lots and lots of talk about mindfulness. Probably everybody here has an idea what you think mindfulness is. In this tradition, mindfulness is simply about remembering to practice, remembering what Buddha taught. So, kind of remembering what we're doing and why. Why are we taking on this crazy practice, right? What are we here to do? And then, I kind of think there's the piece there about intention, right? Like, I'm on this path, like, what's my intention? How do I intend to live? And then I remember that. Again, vow and repentance is important. So, yes, there are exercises out there where, you eat a raisin, or you eat an orange section, or a potato chip, and you focus on all the sensations that arise from that. That's lovely. That is not what mindfulness means here. It simply means remember to practice, right? So memory keeps coming up in this practice tradition. And that could be a whole other interesting, like someday I'll give a Dharma talk about that, because memory is really interesting. Chanting, when we do chanting in the morning, or when we put on a raksu, or in front of a meal, right? Chanting is about remembering teachings. We're verbalizing teachings, because we're getting them in the body, we're remembering them. I don't know if you've had this experience, but sometimes when we've been practicing for a while and we've been doing the same chant enough that we're no longer having to read it, it's just coming out, our experience of that content shifts dramatically because we're not having to go through the mechanics of I'm reading and stumbling over the words, and right? Somehow it's coming out of my mouth and I'm like, oh. When I started practicing, I was in a place where at the end of the day during Sanshin, every night we would chant Fukanza Zengi. It was the last thing we did before we left the Zendo for the night. And you do it enough, one day I realized I didn't need to read it. And so I was chanting along. And the first about 3 lines, I went, oh, that's what that means. Oh, that's Dogen's, 3 questions. Oh, that, because like up to that point it had been, I'm just making noise, right? Memory is really interesting. Now this is my body. It's like, oh, that means something to me. So chanting, there's an interesting piece there about remembering teachings. When we sit Zazen, right, we drop distraction. We remember how things really are. Oh, this is not about my fabrication. Oh, this is not about my distraction about that conversation I had with somebody at work, right? Oh, it's about this. Here, now, this body, mind, right? Let's remember, it's this. It's, the fabrication is not unreal, but it's this, right? There's memory, I think, going on there. Changing our habits of body, speech, and mind, which is quite a bit of what our practice feels like sometimes, right? Like we've got these really deeply ingrained habits of speech and thinking and what we're doing with the body. It means we need to keep remembering, oh yeah, I don't want to do that thing anymore. Oh yeah, my intention has been to let go of that and do this instead, right? Memory. So mindfulness is really an interesting part of this Eightfold Path, if we look at it that way. Right? I think there's some really concrete stuff there. Finally, concentration, right concentration, sometimes right meditation or right samadhi. So understanding of this particular element shifts across time and space from one Buddhist tradition to another. In early Buddhism, concentration was about sort of withdrawing from sense distractions, the craving and aversion that comes with 6 sense gates. And doing that was about achieving some kind of equanimity or mindfulness, right? That results in something ranging from a feeling of sort of basic contentment to some kind of rapturous peak experience. So folks did this by concentrating on something to the extent that it filled their entire awareness, and then your entire awareness takes in this object. So there is very much something about I'm focusing this to some degree to the exclusion of sense distraction. And we can see where now sometimes our understanding of mindfulness gets shifted around by some of those early practices. So if you're reading early texts, you run across phrases like, they want to stilling directed thought, for instance, right? Kind of taking all that in, right? So how is that different from what we do in Zazen? Well, the key is intentionality or lack of intentionality. Our Zazen has no goal. Our Zazen has no purpose. So in Zazen, we are not focusing on something in order to completely fill our awareness with it and drop off distraction from the six sense gates, right? There is no object, right? Zazen is Zazen is good for nothing, as we say, right? So when we sit, we create thoughts because we have past karma in this human form. We've come from work, or we had an experience as children, or we have likes and dislikes, or I have pain in my knee because, right? And so there's things in this karmic body. We create thoughts because of all of that. If we're in relationship with the thoughts, I'm judging my thoughts, I'm embroidering those things, I'm writing a story, I am here, and my thought is there, and now we have thinking, right? This is how thinking happens. If the thoughts are simply coming and going, but I'm not grabbing them, I'm not interacting with them, I'm not writing a story about them, there is no subject and object. There is no I that's doing thinking. There's no I having a thought. Are thoughts coming up? Yes. Are they going to come up as long as this body is alive? You bet. I mean, if there's no thinking happening here, we're dead. That's not what Zazen is. Thoughts are going to happen because we're in this karmic form. The question is, what are we doing with them? How are we engaging with them? How are we grabbing them and making them into something? Or are they simply coming and going? This simply coming and going with no subject-object, no I and that's thinking a thought, is non-thinking, Hishiryo. We have lots of teachings in this tradition about thinking and non-thinking, thinking, not thinking, and non-thinking. This is non-thinking, Hishiryo. Thoughts are coming and going. We're not grabbing them. So this is not about concentration by like thinking hard about something. I like to think about concentration in this context as distilling. So sometimes we say something is concentrated. Orange juice concentrate, right? Laundry soap is concentrate. How do we distill down to the essence? How do we drop everything that's extra? How do we see that fabrications are fabrications? How do we see what's really going on? That is concentration, I think, in this context. Okay? So it's about letting go of extra, nothing extra, which is another common phrase for us here, right? Nothing extra. Okay, that is a whirlwind, no pun intended because it's a wheel. Look at the Eightfold Path. Does anyone have immediate questions? And again, we can discuss in some depth at the end. Anything immediately that doesn't make sense, words you missed? Everyone good? Okay, again, there's tons of homework you could do on this. This is a life practice. Okay, so moving to precepts. Now, we just saw that ethics or morality is one of these three categories, right? That's the Shila category in this Eightfold Path. So for us, that means precepts. In July, we're going to spend 5 days on these things during the precepts retreat, so I'm not going to spend 2 hours on this now. We have 5 days to talk about this every morning. So I'm going to do an introduction here so we all know what we're dealing with, but this again is a lifetime study. I see some Raksus at home. There's certainly Raksus here. Some people have taken the precepts. This will be review for you and not new material. Okay, so we have 16 precepts in this tradition. It's the same 16 that we take when we're lay people, or if we're ordaining as novices, or we do them again at Dharma transmission. So this is the Mahayana, right? In the early practice, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of precepts, like 258 precepts. And there were major ones and minor ones, and there were more for women, because of course we're more diluted, right? So in the Mahayana today...
Well, this is just the Japanese.
And well, I was going to say, so these are the ones we inherit from Dogen through a long path. So in Soto Zen today, these are the 16 that we do. So again, lifetime study, but these are the 16 we're focusing on. So again, these are on, I think, the back of your handout, so you can follow along. I did not give you a long explanation. I simply gave you the list. So those of you who are taking precepts in July, these are the 16 you're going to be hearing and dealing with at that ceremony. All right, so 3 refuges. Now, last time we talked about the 3 treasures, right? Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. So when it comes time to take precepts, we sort of publicly take refuge. I take refuge in Buddha, honored as the highest, Dharma, honored as the stainless, and Sangha, honored as the harmonious. So that might sound a bit like the absolute 3 treasures that Sawyer mentioned, again, that we talked about last time, right? So taking refuge is a big conversation. But we can just sort of be aware that taking the precepts is not simply this list of do's and don'ts. It also means we're vowing to take refuge in the 3 treasures. Then we have the 3 collective pure precepts. So this is kind of a study of good and bad, if you will. How did I write them here? The precept of embracing moral codes, the precept of embracing all good acts, the precept of embracing and benefiting all living beings. So for me, what that says to me, that is a study of good and bad, or wholesome and unwholesome, and going beyond good and bad. It's not enough to just know this is good, this is bad, or this is wholesome, this is unwholesome. In this tradition, we also have to let go of even that label. So 3 collective pure precepts are a way to practice with that. Yeah, okay, there we go. I knew I had him in front of me somewhere. So in this world of form, if we look at these collective pure precepts, in this world of form, embracing moral codes means simply we follow the rules. So that might be the rules of your Sangha, it might be the laws of your state, county, country, whatever. It might be the guidelines you have to follow at work. It might be whatever the codes are, whatever the laws, rules, codes are that affect where you're living and the activity that you're engaged with. In the world of form, embracing all good acts means we're carrying out wholesome activities. We're doing some good in the world. We're doing something in the world which is helpful, wholesome. And it's something we are doing with this body, right? In the world of form, embracing and benefiting all living beings means, of course, we're not just practicing for ourselves. This is not a self-help exercise. This is not an opportunity simply to become someone I like better, right? We are not practicing for ourselves, for our own self-improvement. We are also, I hope, practicing with the understanding that we are liberating all beings from suffering in small ways and in larger ways. That's the world of form. In the larger sense, or the absolute sense, moral codes, embracing moral codes, we see the actual functioning of reality, and then on that basis we don't feel compelled to break precepts, to break moral codes. If I see interconnectedness, I don't feel compelled to do something which I know is going to result in suffering for somebody else. Nobody has to come along and say there's a rule against that, right? I see, and I don't need to have that kind of guideline. In the absolute sense, all good acts, embracing all good acts, our activities in the world are naturally good and wholesome. If we see clearly with wisdom and compassion, then what we're doing in the world is naturally going to be good, wholesome. We don't have any resistance to doing the right thing. Oh, well, I should clean my room, but golly, I'd rather play a video game, right? Oh, well, I should help my neighbor across the street, but I'm already late for, this party I'm going to. So we don't feel any resistance to kind of doing the right thing. In the absolute sense, embracing and benefiting all living beings, well, we understand interconnectedness. We see very clearly that there is no separation between ourselves and others, between other beings. So we can't do anything other than free beings from suffering because we're all functioning together. There's no way I can do something which doesn't affect other beings. So by nature, we're going to be embracing and benefiting living beings because we can't not do that. So in that way, we go beyond good and bad. We don't need to have ideas or judgments about what we're doing. Oh, this makes me a good person. This is a good action. This isn't so good action, right? Our movement through the world, then, is not about us. So Sawaki Roshi, I love this, always says, all good actions are bad actions. And you think, well, that doesn't make any sense. And of course, what he means is any action that I think about and have an idea about and say, oh, that's a good action, That's already delusion. That's already making a choice. That's already making a distinction. That's already creating separation. So all good actions are bad actions. For my friend Sawaki Roshi. Okay, 10 major precepts. These are the ones you might think of more readily when you think about precepts in this tradition. So these feel a little bit more specific because they're about not killing and not stealing and a lot of things like that. So these come from the Bonmo-kyo, or the Brahmanet Sutra. In every case, there is a specific historical reason why Buddha said, don't do this. There's a story attached to it. Something happens, somebody makes a mistake, Buddha hands down a precept, he says, that's not what I meant, don't do that. Or somebody went off the rails, don't be like this guy. So that's the Bonmo-kyo. That's the stuff coming out of the Bonmo-kyo. We also study a larger interpretation of each of these precepts, which comes supposedly from Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma's one-mind precepts. This is the highest, top-level, absolute view. Finally, our third source is Dogen's Kyoju Kaimon, which I think sort of takes the middle ground between these two things. So the Bonmo-kyo, the very early articulations of these precepts are very, very specific. I mean, they're a paragraph long, right? In the early teachings, they're very, very specific. Don't do this. If you have any hand in something like this, it's not okay. Then we've got Bodhidharma's, which is like one line, and it seems very abstract. And then we've got Dogen's Kyoju Kaimon, and I think he's trying to help us navigate, okay, how do we actually act on those things, right? This isn't India 2,600 years ago. And then there's this big absolute thing that we don't know what that means. And so how do you forge a middle path? So all three of those texts, all three of those perspectives shape how we practice with precepts here and today. So for instance, the Bonmo-kyo says, if you kill or you cause something to be killed or you have some hand in killing in some way, you're out of the Sangha. You're done. All right? That's a high enough grade mistake. You're done. Bodhidharma says, well, in the world of emptiness, there is nothing really that's arising or perishing, so there can't be anything that's killing and there can't be anything being killed. So killing can't happen. You can't break this precept because killing can't happen in the largest possible sense. Both of those things are real. Both of those things are true. Both of those perspectives are true. They don't help us so much in daily life, right? Most of us are probably not going to commit murder. Most of us would maybe struggle with the teaching that says, well, there really is nothing, there is no person to kill, and there is nothing being killed because in the absolute sense it can't happen. Well, we go, well, turn on the news, man, right? Like, what does that mean? So Dogen says in the Kyoju Kaimon, by not taking life, one nurtures the seeds of Buddha and is enabled to succeed to the Buddha's life of wisdom. Do not kill life. So it's not an ancient rule. It's not an abstract view. It's our vow. It says, when you get up in the morning, set your intention. You're going to nurture beings and not kill them. Now we have something to work with. So we vow not to kill things. In that way, that's a vow to cultivate practice and awakening for ourselves and for others. It is simply another statement of sort of bodhisattva vows, right? I'm here to liberate beings from suffering, not to make beings suffer by killing them. So precepts are not lists of rules and do's and don'ts and all of that. They really describe the activity or the life of a bodhisattva. So when we take these precepts, what we're doing is saying, this is what my life looks like now. Are we going to break those precepts? You bet. We're going to break every single one of them. And sometimes people say, well, I can't take the precepts because I know I'm going to break this one. Yes, you will. And when we talk about vow and repentance, we'll understand how we practice with that. So these are vows that don't ever come to an end. We're not going to completely accomplish them, and yet, right, we take them anyway. So these things are a lifetime study, a lifetime practice. They can be very subtle. They can bring up a lot of conundrum. It seems very simple. Don't kill people. Don't take their stuff. Don't say bad stuff about people that isn't true. I mean, right? If you look at that list, you would go, yeah, I don't have any intention of doing any of those things. All of those things seem unhelpful. I don't have any, that's not me. I don't live that kind of life. And when we really look at the subtlety of that, we go, oh, right? So people ask things like, well, what about euthanasia? Or what about whistleblowing in the Sangha? Am I not saying bad things about somebody even though I know there's something toxic happening? Or what about drinking champagne at my sister's wedding? That's an intoxicant, right? So these things can have all kinds of, like, oh my gosh, this really is about my life. It's not a list of things to hang on my wall. This really does have something to say about moment by moment, what choices am I making? What activities am I engaged in, right? What am I valuing? What am I thinking? So the important thing that Toto-san always reminds us about precepts is we cannot use precepts as a yardstick for judging people, other people. We cannot put a yardstick out here called precepts and going, well, you missed this one, so you're out of my life. We cannot hold these things up and use them to judge other people, either people we know or people we don't know or people we see on the news or whatever, right? I'm better than you because I keep precepts and you don't keep precepts and you fell down and broke that one and so, right? Not what these things are for. Precepts are about our own practice. This is our own aspiration. We keep these things as the basis of our own practice life, our own intention to move through the world as a bodhisattva, not as a means of evaluating other people, because that's a slippery slope, right? These things are way too subtle. The other thing that's important to know when we see somebody else taking action is we don't understand all their karmic circumstances. We don't know what's driving them to do what they're doing. We don't know what's in their minds. We don't know what their karmic influences are. That doesn't mean we ignore toxic behavior. Sometimes we need to deal with toxic behavior, but we need to do that in a very wise and compassionate way, and not based on, I'm better than you because I have a list. You don't have a list. Okay, good. 8 o'clock. Another whirlwind, but we have time for a little bit of discussion if people want to do that. So I will just say, I did give you some thinking questions again this week if you choose to take those on. If this is already familiar territory to you and you want to dig in a little deeper about the relationships and connections between things, how we might practice with these things, that's some additional thinking you can do. And again, you might set yourself a writing exercise, you might discuss with someone over coffee, you might simply sit and think about that, reflect on it in your own practice. If this is new territory and you're just kind of clinging to the horse's mane, that's fine. But if you really want to dig in or you want to talk with others, you may certainly do that.